Rich man laughed at black woman at airport, not knowing she was the judge at his hearing. What happens when a powerful man humiliates someone he thinks is beneath him, only to discover she holds his entire future in her hands? This is a true story about dignity, justice, and the moment when karma arrives in the most unexpected way. Before we begin, if you believe that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, should be allowed to treat others with cruelty and get away with it, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories of courage, justice, and transformation that will restore your faith in humanity. And if this story touches your heart, if it makes you feel something, leave a like on this video. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of hope. One more thing, write in the comments where you're watching from. Let's see how far this message of dignity and justice can travel around the world. Now, settle in. Because what you're about to hear will remind you that sometimes justice comes dressed in unexpected ways. And cruelty? Well, cruelty always has a price. Let's begin. The fluorescent lights of Kennedy International Airport cast harsh shadows across the polished floor. Margaret Hayes stood in line at Gate 47, her worn black suitcase beside her, clutching a folder marked Federal Court, Confidential, against her chest. She had been traveling for 16 hours, 2 connecting flights, 3 airport lounges, and countless stares that reminded her, even in 2023, that a black woman in a business suit still drew assumptions. The departure board blinked. Flight 2847 to Atlanta, delayed. Margaret sighed, adjusting the simple gold cross around her neck. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Baby, when the world tries to make you small, you stand taller. Your dignity is yours alone. Excuse me, ma'am. The voice came from behind, sharp, impatient. Margaret turned to see a man in his early 50s, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His eyes barely registered her face before scanning past her, as if looking for someone more important. You're blocking the priority boarding line, he said, his tone dripping with entitlement. Margaret glanced down. Her foot was barely touching the red carpet designated for first-class passengers. She stepped aside immediately. Sorry, I didn't realize. Of course you didn't. The man, Marcus Whitmore, though she didn't know his name yet, brushed past her, his leather briefcase swinging dangerously close to her face. People like you never do. The words hung in the air like smoke. People like you. Several passengers turned to look. An elderly couple frowned. A young mother pulled her child closer, uncomfortable with the tension. Margaret's fingers tightened around her folder, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that responding to cruelty often only fed it. Whitmore stepped up to the counter, flashing his platinum card with theatrical flair. Marcus Whitmore, first class. I assume my upgrade went through? The gate agent, a young Latina woman named Sophia according to her name tag, typed quickly. Yes, Mr. Whitmore. You're confirmed in 2A. Good. I have a critical meeting in Atlanta. A federal court hearing tomorrow morning. He laughed. A cold sound without warmth. Some ridiculous discrimination lawsuit. These people always think they deserve a handout. Sophia's smile tightened, but she remained professional. We'll begin boarding shortly, sir. Whitmore turned back toward the waiting area, his eyes landing on Margaret again. She had moved to a seat near the window, trying to review her notes despite the fluorescent glare. You know, he said loudly, addressing no one in particular but making sure everyone could hear. I remember when airport lounges actually meant something. When you knew everyone in first class belonged there. His gaze fixed on Margaret. Now they let anyone in. Diversity hires probably. Affirmative action. A businessman nearby chuckled uncomfortably, then looked away, ashamed. Margaret's jaw clenched, but she kept her eyes on her papers. Inside the folder were depositions, evidence, testimonies, the voices of 17 people who had suffered under Whitmore Industries' systemic discrimination practices. She hadn't known his name when she boarded the flight in Los Angeles. She hadn't known his face. But now, hearing his voice, watching his performance of privilege and contempt, She knew exactly who Marcus Whitmore was, and he had no idea who she was. "Ma'am?" Sophia's voice was gentle. "We're boarding Group C now." Margaret stood, gathering her belongings with quiet dignity. As she walked toward the gate, Whitmore made a show of stepping aside, pulling his expensive briefcase close as if she might contaminate it. "Careful," he muttered to the man beside him. "You never know what these people might steal." The words were meant to be heard. Margaret stopped. For just a moment she turned and looked directly into Marcus Whitmore's eyes. She said nothing. Her gaze was steady, calm, and somehow more powerful than any words could have been. In that brief silence, something flickered across Whitmore's face. Confusion, perhaps, or the faintest shadow of discomfort. But it vanished quickly, replaced by his practiced sneer. She continued down the jetway. Inside the plane, Margaret found her seat in row 23. Middle seat, between a sleeping teenager and a businessman absorbed in his laptop. She carefully stowed her folder in the overhead compartment, sat down, and closed her eyes. The humiliation burned, but beneath it was something stronger. Something forged through years of being underestimated, dismissed, and doubted. Faith, hope, and the unshakable knowledge that tomorrow morning, in a federal courtroom in Atlanta, justice would have its moment. She didn't know that 3 rows ahead, Marcus Whitmore was already drafting an email to his lawyer. "Wrap this case up fast. These people have no idea who they're dealing with." She didn't know that his company had buried evidence, silenced witnesses, and used every legal maneuver to delay the trial for 3 years. But she did know one thing. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. As the plane lifted into the night sky, Margaret Hayes, Judge Margaret Hayes, recently appointed to the Federal District Court of Georgia, whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her 50 years ago. "Lord, grant me the wisdom to see clearly, the courage to speak truth, and the grace to remember that even those who hurt us are still your children." The irony of the situation wouldn't reveal itself until 9 a.m. the next morning. When Marcus Whitmore walked into courtroom 7B, expecting a quick settlement and a forgettable day, he would look up at the bench and see a face he recognized. The woman from the airport. The woman he had mocked, dismissed, and dehumanized just hours before. Sitting behind the judge's bench, wearing the black robes of federal authority, holding his entire future in her hands. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, the plane flew through darkness, carrying 2 people toward a collision that would change both their lives forever, though only one of them knew it was coming. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta stood like a monument to justice. 12 stories of marble and glass, with the words, "Equal justice under law," carved above the entrance. Margaret arrived at 7:30 a.m., 2 hours before the hearing. She always came early. It gave her time to center herself, to review the facts one more time, to remember why she had spent 23 years fighting her way through a system that hadn't been designed for people who looked like her. Her chambers were modest but dignified. Law books lined the walls. On her desk sat a photograph of her parents. Her father, a postal worker who had died never seeing his daughter become a judge, and her mother, who had cleaned houses for 40 years to pay for Margaret's education. "You're going to change the world, baby," her mother had whispered on her deathbed, not by being louder than them, but by being better. Margaret put on her black robe slowly, feeling the weight of it. Not just the fabric, but the responsibility, the power to impact lives, to correct wrongs, to give voice to the voiceless. She had read the Whitmore Industries case file 17 times. 17 employees, mostly Black and Hispanic, who had been systematically passed over for promotions, denied equal pay, subjected to hostile work environments, and ultimately fired when they spoke up. The evidence was damning. Internal emails referring to those people and diversity problems. Performance reviews that suddenly changed after employees filed complaints. Severance agreements that included aggressive non-disclosure clauses. Marcus Whitmore had built an empire worth $300 million, but he had built it on the backs of people he considered beneath him. At 8:45 a.m., Margaret's clerk knocked on the door. "Judge Hayes, they're ready for you." Margaret picked up her gavel, took a deep breath, and walked toward the courtroom. Marcus Whitmore sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits. His lead counsel, Gerald Frost, was a notorious defense attorney known for crushing civil rights cases before they ever reached trial. "This will be over by lunch," Frost assured him. "The judge is new. First major case. She'll want to settle quickly, avoid controversy." Marcus nodded, barely listening. He was scrolling through his phone, reviewing stock prices. The lawsuit was an annoyance, nothing more. A minor inconvenience in an otherwise perfect week. The plaintiffs sat on the opposite side, 17 people whose lives had been upended. Among them was Thomas Wright, a 52-year-old black man who had worked in Whitmore's shipping department for 18 years before being fired for attitude problems after he reported racial slurs from his supervisor. Beside Thomas sat Maria Gonzalez, a single mother who had been denied maternity leave and then terminated for performance issues when she complained. Their lawyer, Janet Kim, was young but fierce. She had taken the case pro bono after larger firms refused, afraid of Whitmore's reputation for destroying opponents in court. "All rise," the bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. Marcus stood lazily, still checking his phone. He'd been through dozens of depositions, mediations, legal proceedings. They all blurred together. All ended the same way, with him winning and the troublemakers disappearing. The Honorable Judge Margaret Hayes presiding. The door behind the bench opened. Marcus glanced up casually, expecting to see some anonymous face in a robe. Instead, his eyes locked on a woman he recognized immediately. The woman from the airport. His face went pale. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the table. Margaret walked to the bench with perfect composure, her expression neutral and professional. She sat down, arranged her papers, and only then looked out at the courtroom. Her eyes met Marcus Whitmore's for the second time in 12 hours. This time the power dynamic had shifted entirely. "Please be seated," Margaret said, her voice calm and measured. The courtroom settled. Marcus remained frozen, half standing until Gerald Frost pulled him down by his sleeve. "What's wrong with you?" Frost hissed. That's her," Marcus whispered. "The woman from—" "Focus," Frost snapped. "We've prepared for months. Don't lose it now." But Marcus couldn't focus. His mind was racing back through every word he'd said at the airport, every contemptuous look, every casual cruelty. People like you never do. You never know what these people might steal. They let anyone in now. The words echoed in his head like accusations. Margaret opened the file in front of her. "We are here today for the case of Wright, Gonzalez, and 15 others versus Whitmore Industries, case number 2023 CV 8471. This is a civil action alleging systemic racial discrimination, hostile work environment, and retaliatory termination." Her voice was steady, but everyone in the courtroom could feel the electricity in the air. "Before we proceed, I want to establish something clearly." Margaret looked directly at the defense table. "This court operates on principles of equality, dignity, and respect. Every person who enters this courtroom, regardless of race, gender, economic status, or position, will be treated with fairness under the law." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Mr. Whitmore, I trust you understand that?" Marcus's throat was dry. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good, because justice doesn't recognize privilege. It doesn't bow to wealth or influence. In this courtroom, truth matters more than power." Gerald Frost shifted uncomfortably. He had never heard a judge open a proceeding this way. "Now," Margaret continued, "I've reviewed the pretrial motions and the evidence submitted by both parties. Mr. Frost, your client filed a motion to dismiss based on lack of standing. I'm denying that motion." Frost stood quickly. "Your Honor, with all respect, the plaintiffs have failed to establish—" "I've read your arguments, Counselor. They're insufficient. The plaintiffs have documented evidence of discriminatory practices dating back 5 years. We will proceed to examine that evidence." Marcus leaned toward Frost. "Can we request a different judge? There has to be a conflict of interest." Frost looked at him sharply. What are you talking about? I met her before. At the airport. I didn't know. You met the judge? When? What did you say to her? Marcus's silence was answer enough. Frost closed his eyes, realizing the magnitude of the problem. Margaret's clerk called the first witness. The court calls Mr. Thomas Wright. Thomas stood slowly, his hand shaking slightly. He was a big man, but years of humiliation had made him smaller somehow. He walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Janet Kim began her questioning gently. Mr. Wright, how long did you work for Whitmore Industries? 18 years, ma'am. Started in the warehouse, worked my way up to senior logistics coordinator. And why were you terminated? Thomas glanced at Marcus, then looked away. They said I had an attitude problem, but the truth is I reported my supervisor for using racial slurs. 2 weeks later I was fired. What kind of slurs? Thomas hesitated. The words were painful to repeat. But Margaret nodded encouragingly, and he found his voice. He called me and 2 other black employees the N-word. Said we were lazy, said we only had jobs because of quotas. When I went to HR, they told me I was being too sensitive. The courtroom was silent. And when you were fired, what reason was given? They said I was insubordinate, that I didn't respect authority. Thomas's voice cracked. I worked there for 18 years. I never missed a day. I trained new employees. I volunteered for extra shifts, and they threw me away like garbage. Margaret watched carefully, taking notes. Marcus stared at the table, unable to meet Thomas's eyes. Mr. Frost, Margaret said, you may cross-examine. Frost stood, straightening his tie. His strategy was classic. Discredit the witness, make him seem unreliable, emotional, biased. Mr. Wright, isn't it true that you received multiple complaints about your work performance in the months before your termination? That's not true. We have documentation. You have made up documentation, Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. I never had a single complaint in 17 years. Then I report racism and suddenly my file is full of write-ups that I never even saw. Please answer the question directly, Mr. Wright. I am answering directly. You're twisting the truth. Margaret intervened. Mr. Frost, do you have these performance complaints with you? Yes, Your Honor. Frost presented a folder. Margaret reviewed the documents carefully. Too carefully. She noticed something the defense had missed. The dates on the complaints had been altered. Metadata embedded in the digital files showed they'd been created weeks after Thomas's termination. Fabricated evidence. Margaret's expression didn't change, but inside her resolve hardened. Mr. Frost, I'll need the original digital files of these documents with complete metadata submitted to the court by tomorrow morning. Frost's confidence wavered. Your Honor, I'm not sure that's tomorrow morning, Counselor, 9 a.m. The hearing continued for another 3 hours. Witness after witness took the stand, each telling similar stories. Dreams deferred, dignity trampled, lives disrupted because they dared to expect equality. And through it all, Marcus Whitmore sat in silent recognition of a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. His success had been built on the suffering of others. When Margaret finally called a recess, Marcus bolted from the courtroom. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, breathing hard. His whole world was collapsing. Not because he might lose money, though he might, but because for the first time in his life he was being forced to see the human cost of his cruelty. And the woman making him see it was the same woman he had tried to humiliate 12 hours earlier. The same woman who now held his fate in her hands. The afternoon session began at 2 p.m. Marcus returned to the courtroom looking diminished somehow, as if the lunch break had aged him years rather than hours. Gerald Frost had spent those hours on emergency phone calls to other partners at his firm. We need to settle, he'd told Marcus bluntly. This judge isn't going to let us bury this. But Marcus had refused. Not because he thought he could win, but because settling would mean admitting guilt. And admitting guilt would mean acknowledging that everything he'd built was stained with injustice. The court calls Maria Gonzalez, the clerk announced. Maria walked to the stand with her shoulders back, though her hands trembled as she placed them on the Bible. She was 34 years old, but hardship had etched lines around her eyes that made her look older. Janet Kim approached gently. Ms. Gonzalez, can you tell the court about your experience at Whitmore Industries? Maria took a breath. I worked in quality control for 7 years. I was good at my job. I caught defects that saved the company thousands of dollars. When I got pregnant, I requested maternity leave, which was my legal right. And what happened? My supervisor, Mr. Brennan, called me into his office. He said I was being irresponsible and unprofessional for getting pregnant. He said the company had invested in training me and now I was abandoning them. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her pen moving across her notepad. I explained that maternity leave was temporary. Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. But he said women like me always used pregnancy as an excuse to collect benefits without working. He used the word anchor baby in reference to my child. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. 2 weeks later, I was terminated for performance issues that had never existed before. I was 8 months pregnant. I lost my health insurance. I had to deliver my daughter in a county hospital because I couldn't afford private care. Maria's voice cracked, but she pushed forward. My daughter is 3 years old now. She's healthy and beautiful, but I still have medical debt from her birth. And I still wonder what kind of world we've built when a woman can lose everything just for wanting to be a mother. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of someone crying softly. One of the other plaintiffs. Frost stood for cross-examination, but his heart wasn't in it. Ms. Gonzalez, isn't it true that you had received warnings about tardiness? I was late twice in 7 years. Once because my car broke down. Once because my mother was in the hospital. Both times I called ahead and stayed late to make up the time. But you were warned? Yes. 2 weeks after I requested maternity leave, suddenly my file had warnings in it that I'd never seen before. Margaret intervened. Mr. Frost, I assume you'll be providing the original documentation for these warnings as well? Frost's jaw tightened. Yes, Your Honor. With full metadata, tomorrow morning. The pattern was becoming clear. Every time an employee complained about discrimination, their personnel file would suddenly fill with negative reports that hadn't existed before. It was systematic, calculated, cruel. The next witness was James Chen, a 50-year-old man with graying hair and tired eyes. He had worked in Whitmore's accounting department for 12 years. I'm not black or Hispanic, James said quietly, but I witnessed what happened to my colleagues. When I spoke up about it, I became a target too. What did you witness, Mr. Chen? Janet asked. There were 2 promotional tracks. One for white employees, one for everyone else. It wasn't written down anywhere, but it was understood. People of color were given the difficult clients, the impossible quotas, the thankless projects, and when they succeeded despite those obstacles, they were told they weren't leadership material. Did you report this? I went to HR 3 times. The 3rd time, the HR director told me I was imagining things, that I was being divisive. 2 months later, I was let go for restructuring. James looked directly at Marcus. I had a mortgage, 2 kids in college. I lost my house. My marriage fell apart. All because I tried to do the right thing. Marcus felt the weight of those words like physical blows. He had never known James Chen, had never approved his termination personally, but he had created the culture that made it inevitable. Margaret called for a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, she remained at the bench reviewing documents. The bailiff approached quietly. Judge Hayes, there's someone who wants to speak with you, says it's urgent. Who? Marcus Whitmore's wife. Margaret looked up, surprised. Send her to my chambers, 5 minutes. Catherine Whitmore was nothing like Margaret had expected. She was a black woman in her late 40s, elegantly dressed with eyes that carried deep sadness. Judge Hayes, thank you for seeing me, Catherine said, sitting down carefully. I know this is highly irregular. It is, Margaret agreed. I can't discuss the case with you. I'm not here about the case, not exactly. Catherine twisted her wedding ring nervously. I'm here about my husband. And about myself. Margaret waited. I've been married to Marcus for 22 years. We have 2 children. And for most of that time, I've told myself that his attitudes weren't my problem. That I couldn't change him. That as long as he treated me well, I could ignore how he treated others. Her voice broke slightly. But I was wrong. I've been complicit in his cruelty by staying silent. And yesterday, at the airport, I was there. I heard what he said to you. Margaret's expression didn't change, but Catherine saw recognition in her eyes. I didn't know who you were then, but I knew what he was doing was wrong, and I said nothing. Again. Catherine pulled an envelope from her purse. These are internal emails from Marcus's personal account, communications with his executives about how to handle diversity problems. I'm turning them over to the plaintiff's attorney. Mrs. Whitmore, you understand this could destroy your husband's company, your financial security? I understand. Catherine's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. But my children are watching. My daughter is 15, my son is 12. And I realized yesterday that if I keep silent, I'm teaching them that comfort matters more than courage, that money matters more than morality. She stood to leave, then paused. My grandmother was a maid. She cleaned houses for white families who treated her like she was invisible. She worked herself to death so my mother could go to college, and my mother worked herself to exhaustion so I could have opportunities. I met Marcus in college. He seemed different then. Or maybe I just wanted to believe he was. Catherine placed the envelope on Margaret's desk. I can't undo 22 years of silence, but I can stop being silent now. After Catherine left, Margaret sat alone in her chambers for a long time. The envelope sat unopened on her desk. She would give it to the plaintiff's attorney, of course. But first, she needed to process what had just happened. Justice, she thought, was rarely simple. It involved real people making impossible choices, breaking apart families, destroying livelihoods. But sometimes breaking was necessary for rebuilding. The afternoon session resumed with a surprise. Gerald Frost stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, the defense requests a continuance to review new evidence that has come to light. What new evidence, Mr. Frost? Frost looked pale. Internal communications that were not previously available to us. We need time to assess their implications. Margaret knew exactly what he was referring to. Catherine's envelope had already reached Janet Kim. How much time do you need, Counselor? 2 weeks, Your Honor. Margaret considered. You'll have 3 days. This case has already been delayed for 3 years. These plaintiffs deserve resolution. She looked at Marcus, who sat slumped in his chair, defeated. Mr. Whitmore, do you have anything to say? Marcus stood slowly. His lawyers tensed, clearly wanting him to remain silent. But something had broken in him. Your Honor, He stopped, struggling. I met you yesterday. At the airport, I said things, terrible things. The courtroom went completely still. I didn't know who you were, but that's not an excuse. I said those things because that's who I am, or who I've been. He looked at the plaintiffs. I've spent my entire life believing I was better than other people, that my success made me superior, that people who looked different from me, who came from different backgrounds, somehow deserved less. Gerald Frost was frantically whispering, "Stop talking, Marcus, stop." But Marcus couldn't stop. I built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but I built it by stepping on people, by treating human beings as disposable, by creating a culture where cruelty was rewarded and compassion was weakness. He turned to Thomas Wright. You worked for me for 18 years, and I never knew your name. I never cared. To Maria Gonzalez, you were pregnant, and I let someone punish you for it. Punish you for wanting to be a mother. To James Chen, you stood up for what was right and I destroyed your life for it. His voice broke. I can't undo what I've done. I can't give you back the years I stole. But I can stop pretending it didn't happen. I can stop hiding behind lawyers and settlements and non-disclosure agreements. He looked at Margaret. Your Honor, I'm guilty. Of everything they're accusing me of and more. I don't deserve mercy, but they deserve justice. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Gerald Frost had his head in his hands. The other defense attorneys were frantically packing their briefcases, clearly planning to withdraw from the case. Margaret raised her hand and silence fell immediately. Mr. Whitmore, you understand that what you've just said constitutes an admission of liability? Yes, Your Honor. And you've made this statement against the advice of your counsel? Yes. Margaret studied him for a long moment. She saw a broken man, yes. But she also saw something else. The first glimmer of genuine remorse. It didn't erase his crimes. It didn't heal the wounds he'd inflicted. But it was perhaps the beginning of something. This court will reconvene in 3 days, Margaret announced. At that time, we'll discuss settlement terms and restorative measures. Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you spend that time thinking very carefully about what justice actually looks like. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret remained at the bench. She thought about her mother, cleaning houses, her father delivering mail, her grandmother picking cotton in Georgia. All of them had faced Marcus Whitmore's spiritual ancestors. All of them had survived through dignity, faith, and the stubborn belief that justice, though slow, was inevitable. Thank you, a voice said softly. Margaret looked up. Thomas Wright stood near the door, tears streaming down his face. For what, Mr. Wright? For seeing us, for hearing us, for making him see us too. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After he left, she removed her robe and sat in her chambers, looking at the photograph of her parents. We're getting there, she whispered. Slowly. But we're getting there. The 3 days before the reconvening felt like 3 years to Marcus Whitmore. He sat in his penthouse overlooking Atlanta, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt hollow. Catherine had moved out, taking the children to her sister's house. Not out of anger, she'd explained, but out of necessity. They need to see that actions have consequences, she'd told him. Even for people like us. Marcus spent those 72 hours doing something he'd never done before. Actually reading the case files. Not the sanitized summaries his lawyers had prepared, but the raw testimonies. The depositions. The emails he'd sent without thinking twice. One email, dated 3 years earlier, made him physically ill. We need to clean house. These diversity hires are creating problems. Find reasons to let them go. Performance, attitude, whatever works. Just make it look legitimate. We don't need the hassle. He had written that, his words, his orders. 17 lives destroyed by a casual email sent between meetings. On the second night, unable to sleep, Marcus did something else he'd never done. He drove to the neighborhood where Thomas Wright lived. It was a far cry from his gated community. Small houses with chain-link fences, cars that had seen better decades. But there was something his neighborhood lacked. People sitting on porches, talking to neighbors, children playing in yards. Community. He sat in his car outside Thomas's house for an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. In the end, he couldn't do it. What would he say? Sorry I destroyed your life? Words felt inadequate. But Thomas had seen him. Through the window, the older man watched the expensive car idling on the street. He recognized it. Recognized the man inside. Thomas could have called the police, claimed harassment. Instead, he did something that would change everything. He walked outside. Marcus saw him coming, and his hands froze on the steering wheel. Thomas approached slowly, stopping a few feet from the car window. For a long moment, neither man spoke. You lost, Mr. Whitmore? Thomas finally asked, his voice neutral. I don't know what I'm doing here, Marcus admitted. I needed to see. See what? What I took from you. Thomas crossed his arms. You can't see that from a car, Mr. Whitmore. That lives inside. In the nights, I couldn't sleep wondering how I'd feed my grandkids. In the shame I felt when I had to take a job making minimum wage after 18 years of skilled work. In watching my wife work 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. Are you? Or are you just sorry you got caught? The question hung in the air like an accusation and a challenge. 3 days ago, I would have been sorry I got caught, Marcus said slowly. Today I'm sorry for what I did, for who I've been. Thomas studied him. Words are easy, Mr. Whitmore. Rich men say sorry all the time. Then they go back to their mansions and nothing changes. You're right. Marcus opened the car door and stepped out. Standing face to face with Thomas, he felt smaller despite being physically taller. I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make it right, not just with money. Really right. How? I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out. Thomas looked at this broken man in front of him and saw something he hadn't expected. Genuine remorse. Not performance, not strategy, real pain. My granddaughter asked me yesterday why some people think they're better than others, Thomas said quietly. She's 7 years old, and I didn't know what to tell her. He paused. Maybe you can help me figure out that answer. When court reconvened on Thursday morning, the atmosphere was different. Word had spread about Marcus's admission. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and advocates who had fought similar battles. Margaret entered and took her place at the bench, her expression composed but revealing nothing. We're here to discuss settlement terms and restorative measures, she began. Mr. Frost, I understand your firm has withdrawn from representation. Frost stood, looking uncomfortable. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Whitmore has chosen to proceed without counsel. Gasps filled the courtroom. Representing yourself in federal court was legal suicide. Mr. Whitmore, do you understand that proceeding without legal representation is extremely unwise? Marcus stood. Yes, Your Honor. But I've spent 3 years hiding behind lawyers. I'm done hiding. Very well. Ms. Kim, what are the plaintiffs seeking? Janet Kim stood, presenting a carefully prepared document. Your Honor, the plaintiffs seek the following: full back pay with interest for all 17 plaintiffs. Compensation for emotional distress calculated individually. Immediate reinstatement of health benefits. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing by Whitmore Industries. And most importantly, comprehensive structural reforms to prevent future discrimination. What kind of reforms? Independent oversight of hiring and promotion practices. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees. Establishment of a confidential reporting system. And creation of a diversity advisory board with real power to investigate complaints. Margaret turned to Marcus. Mr. Whitmore, how do you respond? Marcus pulled out a handwritten document. Your Honor, I accept all of those terms. Additionally, I propose the following. He took a deep breath. I will step down as CEO of Whitmore Industries and appoint an independent board to oversee the company's transformation. I will fund a scholarship program for children of employees who were wrongfully terminated. And I will donate 50% of my personal wealth to establish the Dignity and Justice Foundation, dedicated to fighting workplace discrimination. The courtroom erupted. Even Margaret looked surprised. Mr. Whitmore, are you certain? 50% of your personal wealth? Your Honor, I made that money by exploiting people. It was never really mine. This is the beginning of giving it back. Thomas Wright stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, may I speak? Margaret nodded. Mr. Wright. Thomas walked forward slowly. A week ago, if someone had offered me everything I lost, I would have taken it and walked away. But sitting here, listening to my colleagues' stories, I realized something. This isn't just about us. It's about the next person. And the person after that. He turned to face Marcus. Mr. Whitmore, you destroyed my life, but I'm still standing here. You know why? Because my faith taught me that people can change. Not easily, not quickly, but they can. His voice grew stronger. I don't forgive you yet. Maybe I never will, but I'm willing to help you try to be better. Not for you, for all the people you might hurt in the future if you don't change. Maria Gonzalez stood next. My daughter deserves to grow up in a world where women aren't punished for being mothers, where people aren't judged by their skin color or their accent. If this settlement can help create that world, even a little bit, then it's bigger than my anger. One by one, the other plaintiffs stood. Each shared their pain, their anger, their hope, and each agreed to the terms, not because they were fully healed, but because healing was a process, not an event. Margaret listened to every word, taking careful notes. When the last plaintiff had spoken, she addressed the courtroom. What we're discussing here today is unusual. In most civil cases, we talk about monetary damages and nothing more. We treat justice like a transaction. You hurt someone, you pay them, you move on. But that's not real justice. That's just bookkeeping. She looked at Marcus. Real justice requires transformation. It requires the person who caused harm to fundamentally change who they are. Mr. Whitmore, you've made promises today. Big promises. The question is whether you'll keep them when the cameras stop rolling and the attention fades. I will, Your Honor. I'm going to hold you to that, and here's how. Margaret pulled out a document she'd prepared. I'm approving the settlement with one additional condition. For the next 5 years, you will report quarterly to this court on the progress of the reforms at Whitmore Industries. You will meet personally with a representative from each plaintiff's family, and you will complete 1,000 hours of community service, specifically working with organizations that fight workplace discrimination. Marcus nodded. I accept, Your Honor. Furthermore, I'm ordering the establishment of a monitoring committee composed of 3 of the plaintiffs, 2 independent labor experts, and 1 civil rights attorney. This committee will have full access to Whitmore Industries' employment records and will report directly to this court. She paused. This is unprecedented, but so is this situation. 17 people came to this court seeking justice. They could have simply demanded money and moved on. Instead, they're asking for something harder and more important. Genuine change. Margaret's voice softened. Mr. Whitmore, when I was a young lawyer, I watched powerful people make promises they never kept. I watched settlements that meant nothing because no one enforced them. That won't happen here. You've admitted guilt. You've promised change. Now you have to prove it. She raised her gavel. The settlement is approved with the conditions stated. Court adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Marcus faced them without his lawyers, without his practiced corporate smile. Mr. Whitmore, critics say you're only doing this because you got caught. How do you respond? Marcus looked directly into the camera. They're right. If I hadn't been caught, if Judge Hayes hadn't made me face what I'd done, I would still be the person I was. That's shameful. But it's the truth. Are you expecting sympathy? No. I'm expecting to work every day for the rest of my life to be better than I was. What do you say to other CEOs who engage in similar practices? Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. I say you're building on sand. You think your wealth and power make you untouchable, but it just makes you blind. You can't see the people you're hurting until one day you're forced to see, and by then, it might be too late. Inside, Thomas Wright watched the press conference on the courthouse TV. Maria Gonzalez stood beside him. Do you believe him? She asked. I don't know yet, Thomas admitted. But I believe in second chances. Not because people always deserve them, but because sometimes they need them to become who they should have been all along. Maria nodded slowly. My priest says forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about refusing to let someone's past mistakes define your future. Your priest is wise. He also says justice and mercy can coexist. That's what today felt like. Upstairs in her chambers, Margaret removed her robe and sat at her desk. She thought about the airport, about the casual cruelty Marcus had shown her. She thought about how close she'd come to recusing herself from the case, to letting someone else handle it. But she hadn't. And because she hadn't, 17 people got their day in court, got to tell their truths, got to witness someone powerful finally being held accountable. Her phone rang. It was her mother. Baby, I saw the news. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Mama, but this is just the beginning. Making someone promise to change is easy. Making sure they actually do it. That's the hard part. I know. But you didn't become a judge to take the easy path. You became a judge to make sure the path leads somewhere worth going. After hanging up, Margaret pulled out a journal she'd been keeping since law school. In it, she'd written quotes, prayers, reflections. She added a new entry. Today I learned that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. It's about creating space for people to become better than they were. That doesn't mean excusing what they did. It means refusing to believe that what they did is all they'll ever be. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there, Marcus Whitmore was beginning the hardest journey of his life. Not to wealth or success. He already had those. But to becoming someone worthy of the second chance he'd been given. And 17 people were beginning their own journeys. Toward healing, toward peace, toward the restoration of the dignity that had been stolen from them. The work was far from over. But for the first time in years, there was hope. 2 years later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the Dignity and Justice Foundation headquarters, a renovated warehouse in a neighborhood Marcus Whitmore once would never have visited. Marcus arrived at 6:30 a.m., as he did every day. Gone were the tailored suits and Italian leather shoes. He wore simple khakis and a foundation polo shirt, his hands often stained with paint or dirt from whatever project needed doing. "Morning, Mr. Whitmore," called Sarah, the foundation's director, a formerly homeless veteran he'd hired after meeting her at a job training program. "Morning, Sarah. Is everything ready for today?" "Almost. Thomas just called. He's bringing his granddaughter." Marcus smiled, a genuine expression that had become more common over the past 2 years. Good. She should see this. Today was the grand opening of the Foundation's 5th Workplace Advocacy Center. This one focused specifically on supporting workers facing discrimination. But more importantly, today marked the completion of Marcus's court-ordered community service hours. 1,000 hours. But he hadn't stopped at 1,000. He'd logged over 3,000. In her chambers across town, Judge Margaret Hayes was reviewing the quarterly report from the Whitmore Industries Monitoring Committee. She'd received 23 such reports over the past 2 years, and each one showed measurable progress. Diversity in leadership positions, up from 12% to 43%. Pay equity gaps, reduced by 67%. Discrimination complaints, down 81%, with 100% resolved through fair process. Employee satisfaction, at an all-time high, but numbers only told part of the story. Margaret had also received letters, dozens of them, from Whitmore employees, thanking her for the changes that had transformed their workplace. One letter sat on her desk, worn from repeated readings. "Dear Judge Hayes, my name is Patricia. I started at Whitmore Industries 6 months ago. I'm a single mother and a person of color, and I was terrified on my first day, knowing the company's history. But something amazing happened. During orientation, Mr. Whitmore himself came and spoke to us. He told us about what he'd done wrong, about the people he'd hurt, and he made a promise that on his watch no one would ever feel invisible again. I've been working for 3 months now, and I've already been promoted based on my merits. My supervisor knows my daughter's name. When I had to leave early for a parent-teacher conference, no one made me feel guilty. This is what work should be. Thank you for making it possible. Patricia Rodriguez." Margaret's assistant knocked. "Judge, there's a ceremony at the foundation today. Will you attend?" Margaret had kept her distance intentionally. She needed to remain impartial, to watch from afar, to ensure that Marcus's transformation was real and not performance. "I'll be there," she said, but quietly. By 10 a.m., the Foundation's community room was packed. All 17 original plaintiffs were present. Thomas Wright sat in the front row, his 7-year-old granddaughter Destiny on his lap. Maria Gonzalez was there with her daughter Isabella, now 5 and full of energy. James Chen attended with his son, who had just graduated college despite the family's financial struggles. Catherine Whitmore sat in the back, accompanied by her teenage children. She had divorced Marcus, but not out of hatred, out of necessity. "I need to rebuild my own identity," she'd explained, "but I'll support the work you're doing." The room quieted as Marcus stepped to the podium, He looked different from the man who had sneered at a black woman in an airport 2 years earlier. His face was lined with exhaustion from genuine work, but his eyes held something they'd never had before: peace. 2 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady, I stood in a courtroom and admitted that I was guilty of systematic discrimination, of cruelty, of treating human beings as disposable. Some people thought I was being strategic. Some thought I was seeking sympathy. The truth was simpler. I had finally been forced to see what I'd become. He paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. Judge Hayes gave me a second chance I didn't deserve. But she also gave me something harder: accountability. She made sure I couldn't just write a check and walk away. She made me do the work. Thomas Wright nodded slowly. Over the past 2 years, I've completed over 3,000 hours of community service. I've worked with labor organizations, civil rights groups, and workers' advocacy programs. I've listened to hundreds of stories from people who've faced discrimination. And I've learned something crucial. I wasn't exceptional in my cruelty. I was typical. The room was silent, everyone hanging on his words. There are thousands of people like I was. People who've convinced themselves that their success makes them superior. People who've built empires on the backs of those they consider beneath them. And the saddest part is they think they're good people. Just like I did. He looked directly at the plaintiffs. I can't give you back the years I stole. I can't erase the pain I caused. But I can make sure that what happened to you never happens to someone else. That's why this foundation exists. That's why we've trained over 500 advocates to help workers fight discrimination. That's why we've partnered with 50 companies to implement real equity practices. Marcus held up a certificate. Today, I officially complete the community service hours Judge Hayes ordered. But I'm not stopping. This isn't a sentence anymore. It's my life's work. The applause started slowly, then built. But it wasn't celebratory. It was acknowledging. Recognizing that transformation was possible, even if it was painful and slow. Thomas Wright stood, destiny still in his arms. Mr. Whitmore, 2 years ago, you asked me how you could make things right. You remember what I told you? You said words were easy, that I needed to prove it through action. That's right. Thomas set destiny down and walked forward. I've watched you over these 2 years. I've seen you show up at community meetings. I've seen you listen more than you talk. I've seen you write checks when no one was watching and no cameras were rolling. He extended his hand. I'm not saying everything is healed. I'm not saying I've forgotten. But I am saying you've earned something I didn't think I'd ever give you. My respect. Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he shook Thomas's hand. Thank you. That means more than you know. Maria Gonzalez stood next. My daughter Isabella starts kindergarten next month. Because of the settlement, I have health insurance again. I have stable work. I have dignity. But more than that, I have hope that she'll grow up in a world that's a little bit better than the one I knew. She looked at Marcus. You're part of why that world exists. Not because of what you said, but because of what you've done. One by one, the other plaintiffs shared similar sentiments. Not forgiveness, some wounds were too deep for that, but acknowledgement, recognition that someone who had been broken had worked to rebuild themselves. In the back of the room, Margaret Hayes watched silently. She had removed her judicial robe, but not her judicial responsibility. She'd spent 2 years monitoring this transformation, ready to intervene if it proved hollow. But it hadn't been hollow. Marcus Whitmore had done something rare. He had actually changed. After the ceremony, as people mingled over coffee and pastries, Margaret approached Marcus. Judge Hayes, he said, standing immediately. I didn't know you were here. I needed to see for myself to make sure this was real. And what's your verdict? Margaret smiled slightly. This isn't a verdict, Mr. Whitmore. This is life. And life is messy and complicated and never fully resolved. She gestured to the room full of people, former enemies now working together, building something new from the ashes of something broken. But I will say this. You've honored your commitments. You've done the work. And most importantly, you've created something that will outlast you. The foundation? No. The precedent. You've proven that powerful people can change, that accountability can lead to transformation, that justice and redemption can coexist. Marcus nodded slowly. I couldn't have done it without you forcing me to face what I'd become. Yes, you could have. You just needed someone to hold up a mirror. Thomas Wright approached with Destiny. Judge Hayes, Destiny, this is the judge I told you about, the one who made sure the right thing happened. Destiny looked up at Margaret with wide eyes. Are you magic? Margaret laughed, a genuine, joyful sound. No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who believes people deserve dignity and justice. My grandpa says you're a hero. Margaret knelt down to Destiny's level. Your grandpa is the hero. He stood up when it was hard. He told the truth when it was scary. That's what real heroes do. She looked up at Thomas. How are you doing? Really? Thomas considered the question carefully. 2 years ago, if you'd asked me that, I would have said I was surviving. Today, I'm thriving. I got my job back, not at Whitmore Industries, but at a company that values me. My wife and I are rebuilding. And most importantly, Destiny sees that standing up for what's right actually matters. He paused. I still have hard days. Days when I remember the humiliation, the fear, the anger. But I also have days like today when I see that my pain wasn't meaningless. It created change. Maria joined them, Isabella tugging at her hand. Judge Hayes, I wanted to thank you. The scholarship Mr. Whitmore established paid for my nursing degree. I graduate next month. That's wonderful, Maria. It is. But the best part isn't the degree. It's that Isabella sees her mama as someone strong, someone who fought back and won, someone who didn't let injustice have the final word. James Chen approached next. Judge, because of the settlement, my son graduated debt-free. He starts medical school in the fall. He wants to serve underserved communities. Says he wants to fight inequality the way you did. Margaret felt her throat tighten. You all fought for yourselves. I just made sure you were heard. You did more than that, Thomas said. You showed us that the system could work. That justice wasn't just for people who could afford expensive lawyers. That a black woman in a courtroom could hold a powerful white man accountable. He gestured to Destiny. She'll grow up knowing that, believing that. That's your legacy, Judge. As the event wound down, Marcus found himself standing alone on the foundation's back patio, looking out at the neighborhood. Catherine joined him. How are you holding up? She asked. Tired, but good tired. Like I've actually earned my exhaustion. The kids want to see you next weekend. I told them yes. Marcus looked at her surprised. Really? They need to see what you've become. Not to excuse what you were, but to understand that people can change. Catherine's voice softened. I'm proud of you, Marcus. I don't say that to absolve you or to pretend everything is fine between us, but I say it because it's true. Do you think they'll ever forgive me? The kids? Maybe. Maybe not. But they'll respect you. And sometimes, that matters more. Inside, Margaret was preparing to leave when Marcus stopped her. Judge Hayes, I never properly apologized for the airport, for what I said, for who I was. You've apologized through your actions, Mr. Whitmore. That's more meaningful. Still, I need to say it, I'm sorry. I was cruel, dismissive, and prejudiced. I treated you as less than human because of the color of your skin. There's no excuse for that. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Do you know what struck me most that night? It wasn't your words, I'd heard worse, it was how casual it was, how automatic. That told me it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was who you were. You're right. But what strikes me now is how different you are. The way you listen, the way you defer to others' expertise, the way you actually see people. She paused. That transformation is rare, Mr. Whitmore. Don't waste it. I won't. I promise. As Margaret walked to her car, she passed a group of young advocates training for their certification. They were diverse, different races, backgrounds, experiences, and they were learning how to fight for workers' rights, armed with tools and knowledge that Marcus Whitmore's foundation had provided. The irony wasn't lost on her. A man who had once practiced discrimination was now funding the fight against it. A man who had once destroyed lives was now helping rebuild them. Justice, she thought, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation, about creating space for people to become better than they were. 6 months later, Margaret sat in her chambers, reviewing a new case. A discrimination lawsuit against a tech company. Similar patterns to Whitmore Industries. Systematic exclusion, hostile environment, retaliation. But this time, something was different. The plaintiff's attorney had cited the Whitmore case as precedent, and the defendant's attorney had reached out, asking if there might be a way to resolve things through restorative justice rather than pure litigation. The Whitmore case was becoming a model, a template for how accountability and transformation could work together. Margaret's phone rang. It was Thomas Wright. "Judge Hayes, I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all, Thomas. What can I do for you?" "I wanted you to know. Destiny's School did a project on heroes. She chose you. Drew a picture of you in your robe and everything." Margaret's eyes misted. That's incredibly sweet. She wrote that you taught her grandpa that justice is real, that standing up matters, that good people can win." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I just thought you should know the impact you've had, not just on the case but on my whole family, on all of us." After hanging up, Margaret pulled out her journal and wrote a final entry. "Today I learned that justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about what ripples out into the world afterward. When we hold people accountable, we create possibility for change. When we demand transformation, not just punishment, we create space for redemption. And when we refuse to accept that cruelty is inevitable, we create hope." She looked at the photo of her parents on her desk. Her father, who had never seen her become a judge. Her mother, who had lived just long enough to see her sworn in. "We're changing things," she whispered. "Slowly. One case at a time. One person at a time. But we're changing things." 5 years after the verdict, the Dignity and Justice Foundation had expanded to 12 cities. Marcus Whitmore, now 62, had stepped back from day-to-day operations but remained actively involved. He'd become a speaker, traveling to companies and universities, sharing his story not as a success story but as a cautionary tale. "I spent 50 years believing I was a good person while doing terrible things," he would tell audiences. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for a judge to force you to see. Look now. Act now. Change now." Thomas Wright had become the foundation's board president. Maria Gonzalez, now a registered nurse, ran health advocacy programs. James Chen led financial literacy workshops for workers facing discrimination. The 17 plaintiffs had scattered across the country, but they stayed connected. Every year on the anniversary of the verdict, they gathered for dinner. Not to relive the pain, but to celebrate the transformation that had come from it. And Judge Margaret Hayes continued her work, case by case, building a legacy of justice tempered with mercy, accountability balanced with grace. She never forgot the moment in the airport when Marcus Whitmore had tried to make her feel small. But she also never forgot the moment he had stood in her courtroom and admitted his guilt. Both moments were real. Both mattered. People asked her sometimes if she believed in redemption. "I believe in transformation," she would answer. "I believe people can change if they're willing to do the work. But I also believe we don't owe anyone our forgiveness. We owe ourselves healing. And sometimes watching someone else change is part of that healing." On a warm spring evening, Margaret received an invitation in the mail. Marcus Whitmore was receiving a humanitarian award for his work with the foundation. The ceremony would be at the same hotel where that courthouse was located, where everything had changed. She decided to attend. When Marcus took the stage to accept the award, he spotted Margaret in the audience. He paused his prepared remarks. Before I say anything else, I need to acknowledge someone. Judge Margaret Hayes is here tonight. 5 years ago, she had every reason to throw the book at me, to make an example of me, to destroy everything I'd built. The room was silent. Instead, she did something harder. She held me accountable while still believing I could be better. She demanded transformation, not just punishment. And because of that, 17 people got justice. Thousands of workers got better workplaces. And I got a chance to become someone I'm not ashamed to see in the mirror. He looked directly at Margaret. Your Honor, this award has my name on it, but it belongs to you. And to Thomas, Maria, James, and all the others who had the courage to demand change and the grace to believe it was possible. The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, Marcus approached Margaret. Thank you for coming. I almost didn't. I'm glad you did. He paused. You know what the strangest thing is? I'm happier now than I ever was when I had everything, when I was rich and powerful and horrible. Why do you think that is? Because now I'm connected. To people, to purpose, to something bigger than myself. I spent 50 years isolated at the top. Now I'm in community, and it turns out that's where life actually happens. Margaret smiled. That's a valuable lesson, Mr. Whitmore. I hope you keep teaching it. As she drove home that night, Margaret thought about the arc of the past 5 years, about how a single moment of cruelty in an airport had led to a transformation that affected thousands of lives. She thought about Destiny Wright, now 12 years old, who wanted to be a lawyer like Judge Margaret. About Isabella Gonzalez, who told everyone her mama was a superhero. About all the workers who now had protections they didn't have before. And she thought about Marcus Whitmore, the man who had tried to make her feel invisible, who now spent his days making sure no one else ever felt that way. Justice, she realized, wasn't always swift. Sometimes it took years. Sometimes it required patience and faith and the stubborn belief that change was possible. But when it finally arrived, it was sweet. Sweeter than revenge could ever be. Because revenge might satisfy anger, but transformation created hope. And hope, Margaret had learned, was the only thing powerful enough to heal a broken world. 10 years after the verdict, a documentary was made about the case. It was called The Long Arc: Justice, Transformation, and the Whitmore Case. In it, all the major players were interviewed. Thomas Wright, now a grandfather of 3, running community programs. Maria Gonzalez, working as a nursing supervisor and advocating for healthcare workers' rights. James Chen, teaching business ethics at a local college. And Marcus Whitmore, who had written a book called Unlearning Privilege: A Journey from Cruelty to Community. But the most powerful interview was with Judge Margaret Hayes, now semi-retired, but still teaching at law schools. Do you believe Mr. Whitmore truly changed? The interviewer asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. I believe he did the work to change. I believe he continues to do that work every day. But I also believe that transformation is ongoing. It's not something you achieve once and then you're done. It's a commitment you make every morning when you wake up. Do you think this case could be a model for other situations? I think it shows what's possible when we demand accountability and also believe in redemption. But I'll be clear. This only worked because Mr. Whitmore actually did the work. Many people in his position would have fought the verdict, minimized their actions, or written a check and moved on. He didn't. That's what made the difference. What do you want people to take away from this story? Margaret looked directly into the camera. I want them to know that the arc of justice is long, but we can bend it. I want them to know that powerful people can be held accountable. I want them to know that people who've been hurt can heal without having to forgive. And I want them to know that sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to accept that cruelty is inevitable. The documentary ended with footage of the Foundation's 10th anniversary celebration. Hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by the work that had emerged from pain. Children who would grow up in a more equitable world because 17 people had the courage to say, enough. And in the back of the room, barely visible, stood a black woman in a simple dress, Judge Margaret Hayes, watching the transformation she had helped create, knowing that her mother would have been proud. The final words on screen were her mother's words, spoken decades earlier. Baby, when the world tries to make you small, you stand taller. Your dignity is yours alone. And no one, no matter how powerful, can ever take that away. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to never miss stories of courage and justice. Like if you believe dignity matters, share to inspire someone who needs hope today. Your voice counts.